my job to introduce our afternoon speaker. Pastor Brennick Christiansen is a personal friend of mine, so it's a joy to be here and hear his presentation, as well as his wife and children. Also, a former teacher at Faith Lutheran School in Plano. His topic this afternoon is entitled Artful Assassins, Dialectical Detectives, and the Liberal Art of Logic. Reverend Brennick Christiansen, as I mentioned, has taught at Faith Lutheran School in Plano, Texas, before attending Concordia Theological Seminary in Fort Wayne. He currently serves as Associate Pastor and Headmaster at Peace Lutheran Church and Academy in Sussex, Wisconsin. Please join me in welcoming Pastor Christiansen.
Last year, I attempted to give a presentation on grammar, and I decided this year to give a presentation on logic. I had the pleasure of taking a course on logic in my master's program through the University of Dallas. A lot of this is drawn from there, but it's also drawn from some other sources as well. At the end, I have a bibliography that you can look at, and I have a QR code. I copied other people I've seen do it. Did you do that last year, QR code? Maybe that was Joker, but I tried to keep it cool this year, so we'll see how it goes. The art of logic. What is logic? The beginner logician answers this question, what is logic, with a textbook definition. Logic is the science of right thinking. Or perhaps, logic is a branch of philosophy that treats the format and structure of thought. The grammarian answers this question, of course, with his etymologies. That the Greek word behind it all is logos, which we've already heard this week. And he gives a list of meanings of what logos means. Word, reason, the study of, the logical order of, or the long one, the underlying ordering principle behind the essence of a thing. The educator, though, answers this question by springboarding into an entire lesson on how logic is the second of the three roads of the trivium, sometimes called dialectic because of the conversational dialogue that it can cause. It's one of the 7 liberal arts, a versatile platform preparatory for a life of learning. I'm sure you educators have all had something similar like that. Oh, tell me about the liberal arts. Okay, let's go. Let's do it. The theologian wants to give an answer too, especially about this word logos. It's got prominence in the Gospel of John. You've heard it before. In the beginning was the Logos, and the Logos became flesh and dwelt among us. Without question, John the evangelist is telling us and describing Jesus as, the long definition, the underlying ordering principle of the universe. For God himself creates, designs, and sustains communication in rational arguments. They are the end product of logic. God made logic to be an art in itself, worth pursuing by itself, not just for the sake of something else. Just as he created grammatical speech in the beginning, and taught mankind to imitate the speech that he did, because he made them in the image of God, the Lord also created logical argument. And you might think of that as an assertion or claims that are proved. To give a textbook definition of the word art, an art is a well-reasoned capacity to make a thing. The well-reasoned capacity to make. So if you have the art of making tacos, you are making a good taco. Comes from ars, artis, that can also mean skill or craft, or taco making. When you think of the arts and the sciences, a science is a body of knowledge But an art is that which produces a good. Now they often overlap, so don't mishear me, but an art is that which produces a thing, a good. The art of grammar creates words or syntax. The art of logic creates arguments or assertions. Geometry creates shapes, and music creates hymns, as we've been doing this week. I think I'm having to do this one in this presentation actually about hymns. So, the specific good that logic makes is argument or an assertion. And so while the basic content of grammar is the syntax and structure of words, the content of logic is the combining of words to create proofs. The art of logic is to split into 3 sections, each of which have to do with a certain act of the mind. These 3 acts of the mind build upon each other successively, growing into beauty in order that they convey. The 3 acts of the mind are called simple apprehension, judgment, and deductive inference. They are also sometimes called, as Peter Kreeft puts it, understanding, judgment, and reasoning. The first act of the mind deals with the basic understanding of a concept of a thing. So when I say taco, you all have in your mind the idea of what a taco is, its essence. They're not holding a taco. As far as I know, nobody is seeing a taco in here. But you have the concept one in your brain, and that is that simple apprehension. And as you can see from my nice chart here, the word for that you have, the concept apprehended, when you put it into words, it is a term. But as soon as you think something about that taco, your brain has moved into the next act of the mind, into judgment, into assessing something when you join together 2 terms, taco and delicious. Terms can be categorized in terms of affirmation or denial when you're making judgment calls. If you want to experience a judgment, just think of that taco and then think what you think about it. Perhaps if it's mom cooking, delicious. If it's dad cooking, Taco Bell's pretty good. This is a very important concept in the art of logic, and in fact it is what allows God to communicate to us with some very important propositions. For the verbal expression of this judgment is called a proposition. It allows us to say, or allows God to say, it was very good. This is the sign of the covenant. This is my body. The proposition is often a term combined with the word is, form of the linking verb, with another term. So you might think of it as a very simple grammatical sentence. But when you string together groups of these, you get something greater, as we'll see in a second. These propositions have 4 basic types, which many of you have heard of before. They have the letters A, E, I, O. And this is a delightful thing to teach your middle schoolers. For example, the A statement is the phrase, all blank is blank. Or you might say, all S is P. And so if I want my middle schoolers to make an A statement about tacos, would anybody like to volunteer to make an A statement about tacos? Anybody at all? So you have to use the S is the word tacos. Pastor Richard, can you start us off?
Sure. All tacos are delicious.
All tacos are delicious. Thank you very much. And Pastor Richard, if I tell you an E statement is no S is P, can you give me the E statement for the same?
Sure. No tacos are pancakes.
All right, very good. And so you can see that asking middle schoolers especially, but really anybody, it becomes a fun game because I give them one word and then they come up with another word like pancakes. Having taught logic to middle schoolers, it's a riot. When you build up multiple propositions together, you get something called a syllogism. You are familiar with the famous syllogism, perhaps. Socrates is a man, all men are mortal. Therefore, with the logical conclusion of those 2 propositions, Socrates is a man, all men are mortal. Sorry, somebody was going to say it. Go ahead.
Socrates is mortal.
That's right. But beware that this pattern of syllogisms is only a tool. It doesn't immediately give us truth. It just conveys an argument. For example, proposition 1, all all teachers are smart. Proposition 2, all smart people can't yodel. So the argument flows validly if I go with the conclusion all teachers can yodel. However, as you are laughing, you know that's not quite true. Can anybody actually yodel? I am curious. I'd love to hear an example of it perhaps later. This might be one of the most fascinating parts of God's creation of logic, actually. For if we are given false starting information, we cannot draw a new truth out of it. We only know that it's false out of it. We get a false conclusion, a fallacy. We've heard the word before. But if we are given true starting information, we may come upon a true conclusion. And though we have only seen two pieces of evidence, the two propositions, we can deduce or infer from these two propositions something new. And so the third verbal expression is for the deductive inference, which is a mental act. The syllogism is the verbal expression of it. St. Augustine, at one point in his writing called The Teacher, talks about how all knowledge is drawn from something before, and every time you get something new, which is a fascinating faculty of the mind God has given us, it has to have started somewhere. Where did the first premise come from? Where did the first proposition come from? And Augustine, of course, connects it and says it came from Christ. That is the mind of Christ that feeds all knowledge and builds up. This is a chain or series of logical connections. They had to have come from somewhere. Where is that? And so you've heard the arguments for the intelligent designer, of course, or where did the cosmos go against evolution. This is exactly related to that. That logic is used for that sort of thing. The answer is, anybody want to say? Actually, I think I already said it. In the beginning, God was the Logos, and He created and started it all. He creates an ex nihilo. Now, I promised you a very fancy title, and so I really will move on that. But I had to give you the background here for that, for the Artful assassin. So let me give you the historian's answer to what is logic. There's a man named Martianus Capella, who lived in the 4th century AD, and he was the man who coined the term the 7 liberal arts. Capella gives us in his writing, that I'll name here in a moment, he gives us a beautiful personification of each of the 7 liberal arts as a bridesmaid. Each one is a bridesmaid at the wedding of philology and Mercurii. Or you might say philology, which is the personification of learning itself, marries Mercurii, the god of eloquence. So learning and eloquence put together. The implication is that eloquence needs a partner, a spouse even, and book learning is the right match. So the two do marry, and the 7 bridesmaids are, of course, the 7 liberal arts. So let's imagine that we're at this wedding, watching the bridesmaids enter the room. Pastor Peter, can you give us the noise as it comes in? One by one, and now it's time for logic, sometimes known as dialectic, to enter. So I'm going to take you. The name of the work, by the way, in Latin is De Nuptiis Philologiae et Mercurii, which is why it says De Nuptiis up there. Into the assembly of the gods came Dialectic, a woman whose weapons are complex and knotty utterances. Without her nothing follows, and likewise nothing stands in opposition. She brought with her the elements of speech, and she had ready the school maxim which reminds us that speech consists in words, which are ambiguous, and judges nothing as having a standard meaning, unless it be combined with other words. Yet though Aristotle himself produced his twice 5 categories, and grow pale as he tortures himself in thought, well, I won't go into that right now with the 10 categories. I will offer perhaps that I might come back to it later. Capella's personification here, that her weapons are complex and knotty utterances, shows what dialectic hits with, utterances, arguments. Not just a singular word, not just a singular apprehension of a taco, but with an argument about tacos. The next phrase, without her nothing follows, kind of explains the purpose of what logic is all about. To show how something follows from something else you know. Where did that first premise come from and what follows from it, the conclusion. When you hear the phrase, it's a non sequitur, or it doesn't follow that these tacos are delicious, that's exactly what we're talking about, is what follows. And don't forget that grammar is a prerequisite. The order is grammar, logic, rhetoric, on purpose, for logic cannot do her job without a knowledge base of grammar. The personification tells us that the bridesmaid dialectic does judgments, for nothing has a standard meaning unless combined. And so the meanings of words come when you put two words next to each other. Capella does give this call out to Aristotle's famous categories, and at the end, if I have time, and I hope I will, I offer to you that I will show you how to play 20 questions with Aristotle's categories, but we'll have to get there first. The categories are looking to get at the essence of what a thing is, the substance, and that is one of the 10 categories that I mentioned. The art of logic uses these to be able to get at the essence of things. And as you'll see in this next description here, that is exactly what the art of logic is known for in the sense of assassin. So here are the 10 categories. I can come back to it. And here's the next excerpt. So at the gods' summons, this woman entered, rather pale but keen-sighted. Her eyes constantly darted about. Her intricate accord seemed beautifully curled and bound together, and descending by successive stages, it so encompassed the shape of her whole head that you could not have detected anything lacking, nor grasped anything excessive. She was wearing the dress and cloak of Athens, it is true, but what she carried in her hand was unexpected, and had been unknown in all the Greek schools. In her left hand she held a snake, twined in immense coils. In her right hand a set of patterns, carefully inscribed on wax tablets, which were adorned with a beauty of contrasting color. And the wax tablets were held on the inside by a hidden hook. But since her left hand kept the crafty device of the snake hidden under her cloak, her right hand was offered to one and all. Then if anyone took one of those patterns, he was soon caught on the hook and dragged toward the poisonous coils of the hidden snake, which presently emerged, and after first biting the hand relentlessly with the venomous points of its sharp teeth, then gripped the man in its many coils and compelled him to the intended position. If no one wanted to take any of the patterns, Dialectic confronted them with some questions, or secretly stirred the snake to creep upon them until its tight embrace strangled those who were caught and compelled them to accept the will of the interrogator. This is the description of the ideal middle school teacher. Capella's personification is right in suggesting that logic can be at times a little colorless and dry. You might pale but keen-sighted. Concerning her hair, it's on purpose the careful description. I had to look up this word, coiffure. Has anybody actually heard that word, coiffure? Am I saying it right? Yeah. Okay. Beautifully bound and curled together, her hair, with nothing lacking or excessive, meaning it was well kept, but it wasn't like too much, and it wasn't too little. And that is a good description of the art of logic, because it does exactly what you need it to do, not more, not less. While you may compare the bridesmaid rhetoric, certainly has more than she needs. The art of logic keeps all ends accounted for and no fanciful frills. Although she's dressed like Athens or Greece, they did not teach her, and logic was learned more in the Roman schools. Now we discussed that her weapons were utterances, but Capella does describe her left hand as holding a snake with immense coils. So is that an utterance? Well, I will explain why. The unexpected part of her description here, of Capella's description, is that when you take the right hand, you are buying the bait. You are buying into the first premise, if you will. And as you buy into the series of premises, the bridesmaid pulls you in and gives you to the snake in a series of, you might say, propositions strung together in the long coils of a poisonous snake. And this string of from where questions, or where did this knowledge come from, if you grant the first thing, you are hooked. Like, for example, if you're granting that all teachers can yodel or something like that, you will also ultimately get bit by the snake's venom of its conclusion. And so you must be careful, because the tool of logic is just that, a tool. It does not guarantee truth, but it can convey truth. And so if you accept the premise early on, well, the conclusion is going to follow that premise. And the mistake you made is not at the end when you hear the conclusion, but it is by granting the first thing. Like some sort of snake-charming poisoner or assassin, the wielder of logic cannot be stopped. Or if you grant one premise to be true, who can disagree with you? Capella describes this in other parts of his De Nuptiis, that the gods and goddesses feared dialectic because no one can contend with her serpentine proofs, because of her fondness for venom, her deadly sure assertions. Grammar, even, was afraid to accept the coils and the gaping mouth of the slippery serpent. When it comes time for the bridesmaid to describe herself, and let me tell you, she does. The book, I would be glad to share it with you if you want to look. This is 7 chapters in it, and the 7 chapters are each on the liberal art that they're describing. And there's maybe 2 pages of Capella's description, and then the art gives a self-description of all the things pertaining to that art, kind of in like a monologue self-description. It's very fascinating and it's very long. Dialectic briefly mentions that no other art can unfold her subject, or her own subject, meaning rhetoric cannot unfold rhetoric's subject, without logic's reasoning. See, because all of these statements of truth, all of the assertions and propositions in any subject area, biology, astronomy, mathematics, are held together by logical strings of propositions. And so logic is rightly called the art of arts. And oftentimes, if you think, I think I read a couple times that Thomas Aquinas refers to the whole of the trivium, not as the trivium, but as just logic, or logical studies. It's the same for your classroom as well. So, as a middle school, who teaches middle school here? Some of you, or high school as well would be appropriate. I guess it works for younger kids. You need to be the woman of darkened cloak with a serpent, a giant anaconda underneath your cloak. You need to offer the kids something pretty so that they take your bait. You need to have premises that they want to agree with so that they can reach your conclusion. They need to argue this back to you as well, whether it's their essay that they're writing for you that makes sense. So the 5-paragraph essay, I would posit, it actually would just be better. Just teach them to give a series of syllogisms in order, and I bet your paper would be better than 5-paragraph essay. Or if they're asking to go to the bathroom during the middle of your class, well, you have to give me the right premise and conclusion for that, for me to agree with it. Try it out. They think really hard because they really gotta go. So before we jump to Sherlock Holmes, I want to put you on this one last thing about this excerpt from Capella. Once you take the sneaky assassin's poison, that the poisonous coils of the snake would compel you to the intended position, that means that if you're having a discussion with another person, and you might think apologetics here, back and forth dialogue, you might think dialectic, questioning, you're never going to win a conversational argument if you have already ceded the other person's initial premise. So for example, if I say to you, there is no loving God because Walmart is out of toilet paper today. Well, you're never going to grant God's non-existence on account of a store being poorly stocked. That's the silly one. It doesn't follow. However, in more crucial conversational need to learn it because it actually makes them better human beings, better able to converse. The best way to be able to converse with your friends about serious issues or toilet paper issues are by reaching and seeing if they can actually make arguments that flow. Now, there is actually a place, I was astounded to hear, there is a place to intentionally use the fallacies that you have made in your rhetoric presentation, kind of like as a distraction to switch topics. And I want to learn about that one, but maybe I'll save that for next year. But in general, you want to have your syllogisms flow. Because it's easy for your argument to be destroyed. Say if you're arguing on Twitter, if you have a, I don't know if you guys are, I'm not on Twitter, but the people there, they're going to give a lot of fallacies, things that don't follow. And the place to beat them is in their thinking. Don't argue about the thing itself, like there is no loving God. Well, don't argue that one, but maybe you should argue about the connection between that and your brother dying. I apologize if somebody's brother just died. So regarding being compelled by arguments, Capella does get some classroom advice. If your students are just not taking the bait today, if no one wants to grant your initial premise, you must pester them with questions. If you want the students to grant you that Bilbo acted courageously, but nobody seems to care to talk about it, well, should you give up and go to recess? Or should you start asking them questions about him? Like this. Did Bilbo seem timid at first? How about reluctant? Did Bilbo's character change? How so? When did that happen in the story? This line of questioning, you can see, is forming a line of propositions. And not only is it going to give them interest in their eyes, eventually, but it's also going to get them invested. And if you poison them just enough, they will begin to argue back at you. And then you have too much on your hands. If you haven't already guessed, this is Martianus Capella's brief description of Socratic questioning, of Socratic dialogue, of the dialectic part of logic. Capella's advice, well, pulverize the children's brains with so many questions that they can't help but begin to talk about it. And you will, like in the serpent's coils, have squeezed and compelled them into granting your premise and position, and thus you can move on with your conversation and your lesson plan. As my own comment on Capella's logical snake, I do not think it follows that he wants you to force children verbally into conversation, but moreover that you would win them over by maybe a use of a little bit of rhetoric to win them over to your will. This whole time, I have been trying to get at the essence of what logic is. In a sense, this presentation itself is an attempt at logical discourse to narrow down on what the essence is, like the categories. Capella has shown the nature of undeniable argument that flows from a confirmed truth or a confirmed falsehood. So earlier I called this a deductive inference. You're inferring something deductively. And that if you get to the third proposition, the conclusion, you have made that inference, you have done deduction. You've heard that deduction is to conclude a truth based upon the evidence you can get. Okay, so that's deduction. All the evidence that you get, that's... However, the difference then is induction, wherein you make a conclusion based on just your observation. So, deduction, or deductive inference, is you can assert a universal truth based off of all of the pieces of knowledge that you have. For example, the entire corpus, you have knowledge of it all, and then you can make a truth statement. However, induction is when you have observations that are not holistic, they are not for everything, and you make an assertion based off just a sample of that. For the last stretch of this session, I'm going to move a little bit less from lecture and more into discussion back and forth with you, or I'll try. And I'd like to take a look at a passage from Sherlock Holmes. Has anybody not heard of Sherlock Holmes in this movie? I'm assuming that's not the case. I'm not going to go into the whole character of Sherlock Holmes. I'm going to accent one part of it. While you listen to me read this passage, and it will be on the screen, consider whether Sherlock Holmes uses anything of that what we're talking about. Does he use deductive inference? Does he use Socratic questioning? Does he trick and poison his way into conversational victory? Listen to this excerpt from Sir Arthur Conan Doyle's The Adventure of the Blue Carbuncle. Now, so that I don't have to read the first 3 pages, I've only put up some of it, and I'm going to skip around. But consider that Sherlock has just told Watson that Sherlock has not been told anything about the hat. So Sherlock does not know anything about the hat, and the hat is sitting on the chair in front of them. This passage is not really actually about Sherlock deducing a bunch of clues, but it is, in fact, about Watson attempting to do the same. The Adventure of the Blue Carbuncle. I had called upon my friend. I'm going to put the excerpt up when I get to that. I'm just skimming until I get it. I had called upon my friend Sherlock Holmes upon the second morning after Christmas with the intention of wishing him the compliments of the season. He was lounging upon the sofa in a purple dressing gown, a pipe rack within his reach upon the right, and a pile of crumpled morning papers, evidently newly studied, near at hand. Beside the couch was a wooden chair, and on the angle of the back of the chair hung a very seedy and disreputable hard felt hat, much the worse for wear, and cracked in several places. A lens and forceps lying upon the seat of the chair suggested that the hat had been suspended in this manner for the purpose of examination. Skipping a little bit because I don't want to read it all to you. Do you know Peterson, the commissioner? Yes. It is to him that this trophy, the hat, belongs. It is his hat. No, he found it. Its owner is unknown. I beg that you, Watson, will look upon it not as a battered billycock, but as an intellectual problem. Because what does Sherlock enjoy most? Does he enjoy solving crime? Or does he enjoy already having the crime solved? Does he want the victory or does he want the process?
What's the process?
He wants the thrill of the game. The hunt is on. Here's our image here. You can see it's just a simple bowler hat. Watson is peering at it, and Sherlock is doing his thing, of course. I'll show the picture again in a moment. Then what clue could you have as to his identity? Only as much as we can deduce. From his hat? Precisely. But you are joking. What can you gather from this old battered felt? Here is my lens. You know my methods. What you can gather yourself as to the individuality of the man who has worn this article. I took the tattered object in my hands, turned it over rather ruefully, and so this is Watson trying to do what Sherlock does. It was a very ordinary black hat of the usual round shape, hard, much the worse for the wear. The lining had been of red silk, but was a good deal discolored. There was no maker's name, but as Holmes had remarked, the initials HB were scrawled upon one side. It was pierced in the brim from a hat securer, but the elastic was missing. For the rest, it was cracked, exceedingly dusty, and spotted in several places, although there seemed to have been some attempt to hide the discolored patches by smearing them with ink. Watson says, I can see nothing, and he hands it back to his friend. And here's the point. On the contrary, Watson, you can see everything. You fail, however, to reason from what you see. You are too timid in drawing your inferences. So I'll leave that up for a second. So this is the question and answer part. Is Sherlock using deduction, induction, Socratic question, anything? Go ahead. Raise your hand.
hasn't done anything yet. He's just sat there and told him to figure it out.
That's right. They're talking back and forth, though. Does that count as conversation? A little bit. Has Watson been using deduction? No, he kind of just, he has brilliant observations. He's actually seen a lot. And then he says, I can't do it at all. However, think about it. Without me reading the rest of the story, what happens next? I don't know if you remember this story particularly, but what happens in every Sherlock that you've done? Go ahead.
He's probably making deductive inferences from what he observes.
That's right. So, for example, then pray, this is the next line, then pray tell me, what is it that you can infer from this hat? Sherlock picked it up and gazed at it with peculiar introspective fashion, which was characteristic of him. It is perhaps less suggestive than it might have been, he remarked. And yet there are few inferences which are very distinct, and few others which represent at least a strong balance of probability. That the man was highly intellectual, there's an inference, is of course obvious upon the face of it. Also that he was fairly well-to-do within the last 3 years, although he has now fallen upon evil days. He had foresight, but has less now than formerly, pointing to a moral retrogression, which when taken with the decline of his fortune seems to indicate some evil influence, probably drink, at work upon him. This may account also for the obvious fact that his wife has ceased to love him. My dear Holmes! That's an example of how Holmes does inference. He has, however, retained some degree of self-respect. He is a man who leads a sedentary life, goes out little, is out of training entirely, is middle-aged, has grizzled hair which he has cut within the last few days, and which he anoints with lime cream. Wow. These are the more patient facts which are to be deduced from his hat. Also, by the way, that is extremely improbable that he has gas laid on his house. You are certainly joking, Holmes. Not in the least. It is possible that even now, when I give you these results, you are unable to see how they are attained. I have no doubt that I am very stupid, but I must confess that I am unable to follow you. It does not follow, is what I'm saying. For example, how did you deduce that this man was intellectual? For answer, Holmes clapped the hat upon his head. It came right over his forehead and settled on the bridge of his nose. It is a question of cubic capacity, said he. A man with so large a brain must have had something in it. The decline of his fortunes, then? This hat is 3 years old. These flat brims curled at the edge in them. It is a hat of very best quality. Look at the band of ribbed silk and the excellent lining. If this man could afford to buy so expensive a hat 3 years ago, and has had no hat since then, he has assuredly gone down in the world. That's pretty clever. Are any of you parents doing this with your children on a daily basis? It would be a pretty good skill to have, I think. Well, that is clear enough, certainly, Watson said. But how about the foresight and the moral retrogression? Sherlock Holmes laughed. Here is the foresight, said he, putting his fingers upon the little disc and loop of the hat securer. They are never sold upon hats. If this man ordered one, it is a sign of a certain amount of foresight, since he went out of his way to take this precaution against the wind. But since we see that he has broken the elastic and has not troubled to replace it, it is obvious that he has had less foresight now than formerly. So this goes on, and you have heard how Sherlock works in the same way. But is this actually feasible? Is this doable? I mean, perhaps not at the level that Sherlock has, but in my research for this presentation, I was like trying to see if I could do this. So, for example, let's see, who can I pick on in here? Can I pick on you? No, you'll make fun of me later if I pick on you. So if you have long hair, I can perceive that you have a sense of style. Because if you had short hair, you'd be well kept, and you would continue to have it. But since it's nicely brushed over, see, I feel awkward. is using deduction, induction, or abduction. Oh, I gave away my punchline. Has anybody heard of abduction? So there's a third one. Man, I gave it away. It's because this room is hot.
Is that your deduction or?
In a different story, Sherlock says this. So, see the value of imagination. It is the one quality which the other police, Gregory, it is the one quality which Gregory lacked. We imagined what might have happened, acted upon the supposition, and found ourselves justified. So what Sherlock Holmes does is he imagines what might have happened, and then investigates that, and then is justified in it. And he's about 95% correct, as you see. And of course, there are times when he has it wrong, which means that he's a sinful human being also. There is somebody on the internet, and I've shared the file with you at the end, who thinks that it is sincerely possible to be able to manage this. And I'm not really sure that it is. Has anybody ever tried doing something like this other than my awkward attempt right now? All right. Well, are there any questions so far before I move on? I have a couple end ideas here, but any other questions about this sort of thing? Yes? Is Sherlock doing the art of logic? Does it match with the description of the bridesmaid that we read before? It's not a rhetorical question, it's a logical question. Yes?
Well, just he kind of drew Watson in by starting by the example that I had, and then continued to add to that scenario.
Yes.
So
So,
drawing him in.
Socratic questioning is Sherlockian questioning? Is that kind of what you're saying?
I could see elements of it, but maybe not to it.
Good. Thank you. Yes?
Well, in a lot of the books, he says, it's elementary. So I think, you draw someone in by, it wasn't really insulting his intelligence, but like, drawing him in, you can figure this out.
Does that sound like what a teacher is doing? Is Sherlock teaching Watson here? Does Watson view it like that? I don't think so. I think Watson is having a hard time putting up with Sherlock. Yes?
So what he frequently does is he combines sort of generalizations applicable to the time, many of which are sort of out of reach of our knowledge of turn of the century London, and combines these small inferences, and then is willing to make logical leaps and sort of builds this whole narrative. And basically, if the narrative begins to become nonsensical, then he'll sort of modify the narrative beforehand. So that's how, in this one, he's able to later come to the conclusion that man does not have gas laid because he recognizes the stains specifically as a type of heating oil that would be used if you don't have gas in your house, right? And so he combines these different things. But the one thing that he'll do in this one, and then the other one that you referenced, is willing to acknowledge, where am I just at my limits, and this is what I think is the most likely outcome, versus where could I potentially be wrong. And he's willing to just, to a certain extent, put his money down on the highest probability in those cases and come out and say it.
Right, and I think actually Sir Arthur Conan Doyle does a good job in putting Sherlock as kind of the eccentric person who's in a situation to do that, because I think you have to be able to live like that, and I think that's a very good story writing, but I don't know if I've met anybody quite like that in real life. Yes?
Isn't it essentially the scientific method that he's doing? So he makes some observations, makes a hypothesis, begins to investigate what might either confirm or negate the hypothesis, and then draws conclusions. So it's a tweaking. It's not exactly like creating an experiment, but it's basically an educated guess that he then follows through.
Okay. Yeah, and actually that leads me to my next question here. So, Sherlock Holmes was written many years after Plato wrote his Republic. You guys have read the Republic, and you know that it's written kind of like the script, a conversation back and forth, which I'm still waiting for somebody to produce a screenplay. I'd like to see book 1 on stage, please. In that, Socrates tries to find the essences of things, asking what is justice, or what is learning, or what is wisdom, or something like that. But Sherlock's not doing it for the same purpose. He's just doing it for the thrill of finding something out. And you can see, perhaps it's related to the scientific method, is the scientific method wants to have evidence and observations to give you something concrete versus maybe the ancients who were more focused on the essence of a thing, going back to Aristotle's categories there, right? And so you can see the shift that it's certainly related, but it is in fact if you'll forgive the joke, it's a long chain, a snake developed over time in how this works. And if you've ever studied symbolic logic today, or classroom questioning now, it's almost degraded over time. And, does anybody do Socratic conversation in their school? You do it? How does that work?
In literature class,
Okay, tell me about it.
well, I know what answers I want them to give, so I know what I want them to learn in my objectives, so I just ask questions until they figure it out themselves.
Okay.
That's how we do catechesis as a pastor, right? What is baptism? I know the answer. You tell me what the answer is. If they don't get it, then you ask another question.
Yes, that's wonderful, actually. And you know the German translation of what does this mean? Was ist das? What is it? It's kind of like asking for the essence of nature. That's a perfect segue. Thank you. I'm going to actually jump back to, I don't know if we have time to, what time is it? Do I have time to show you how to place 20 questions? This is the wrong one. So Aristotle's categories, alluded to by Martianus Capella, has 10 different things that are different aspects of a term that can be. So a term can be one thing or another. Are most of you familiar with this, or do I need to explain this again? Are you familiar with this? I have 10 minutes. Thank you. The Greek words used here, most of these are question words in Greek. And I kind of translated it over here, what you're asking. So the Greek definition in Aristotle's categories here is, if he's asking about substance, he's asking what is it? What is the ousion, which you know is homoousios. You guys have heard that before. Quantity and quality are asking questions that aren't asking what is it, more like an equality or a predication. They're all asking these auxiliary things. And so you've heard of the essential and the accidental. Have you guys heard of these before? So the accidents, not like a car accident, well actually yes like that, but they're the things that are not the thing itself, but they are extras about a thing. So for example, I'm going to pick on you. What is your name? Nathan. So the essence of Nathan is different than the accidental things about you. So have you ever had short hair? Okay, so is the essence of Nathan in that you have long hair? No? Okay. And how are you sitting right now? Leaning forward a little bit? Is that the essence of Nathan? But does it describe you right now? Okay, so to get at you see how I can ask these questions about him. Where are you right now, Nathan? You're in here. What does Nathan do or make? Facial expression. What kind of person are you, Nathan? Lutheran, good answer. But so far, none of those things have gotten at the essence of it. And so I would posit, I know this is a bonus for what it is, but just because Capella mentioned this. Has anybody ever played 20 questions? When you play with, when I play with elementary school kids, they're always asking me immediately, so if I think of something, they're immediately asking me, is it a car? Is it a tree? Is it a table? And I'm just thinking like, wow, you are never going to get it, and they don't. So in my logic class, we did this, and the Porphyrian tree, if you guys know that, the sequencing of these terms. And I recommend, and I wrote a paper on it that you can see at the end. It wasn't a good paper, but it's there. That in order to win 20 questions the way Aristotle would be, Only the last couple questions are you're actually asking, is it a table? Is it a chair? You're asking about substance, but everything else, you're going to ask about one of these other categories. For example, is it bigger than a bread box? Is about which category? Bigger than a bread box. Which category is that? Relation.
Quantity.
And it could possibly be quantity too. Okay. Is it dark? Will be what?
Quality.
Is it usually found in the kitchen?
Place.
Have you ever seen this in person before? Probably time, right? Okay. Is it something that you use? Do you see how these questions, is it something that you use, are all related to these other things? But logic, the whole point is building up these things that are tangential or accidental, finally allow you to kind of whittle your way down into finally saying, is it a taco, or whatever it is. In the paper I wrote, I apologize. I should have only had 20 questions within the body of the text working up to a final answer, but I didn't actually write it that way. So if you're expecting a great masterwork, it is not there. I think that's probably it for time, but I do have some sources here. Bibliography. I tried this QR code thing that I hinted at before. I have other resources that I didn't reference. There are a couple logic textbooks that I have as PDFs, and there are some papers on how well Sherlock used logic or not. I don't remember what else I'll put in there. But if you want those files, they should be downloadable from the drive right here. Are there any other questions before we're done?
Yeah,
Yes.
do you own a share in a taco restaurant in town?
No, but I would like to do that in my spare time. Anything else? Thank you very much.